Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Conspiraseed. This week, we'll be discussing one of the most intriguing cases that I've ever studied, and we'll talk about whether a group of people disappeared, perished in an accident, or were murdered. If you like the video, please remember to leave a like and share it with your friends. Thank you so much for choosing to spend some time with me today, and let's just get into it.
Nothing like being subscribed to Conspiraseed on YouTube. Nothing like it.
Giorgio Sodder, born in Tula, Italy in 1895, immigrated to the United States when he was 13 and Americanized his name to George Sodder. He never talked much about why he immigrated to the United States, preferring just not to talk about it. George found work with the railroads in Pennsylvania, where his job was carrying water and other supplies to the laborers. After a few years of this, he found better work as a driver in Smithers, West Virginia. He actually goes on to start his own trucking company, at first hauling fill dirt to construction sites, and then eventually hauling coal mined from the area. During his time in Smithers, George meets Jeannie Caprani, a woman who also immigrated from Italy in her childhood, and the two got married. They moved to the outskirts of Fayetteville, which had a large Italian immigrant population. In 1923, they had their first of 10 children. George's business boomed, and they became one of the most respected middle-class families around, according to one local official. George, much like many people on the internet today, had many strong opinions on many subjects and wasn't shy to tell others about them. One of his strongest opinions was his dislike of Italian dictator Benito Mussolini. This dislike had led to some heated arguments with other members of the Italian immigrant community. The last of the Sodder children, a girl named Sylvia, was born in 1942. By this time, their second oldest son, Joe, had left home to serve in the military during World War II. The next year, Mussolini was executed, but George's criticism of the dictator had left some hard feelings in the community. A visiting life insurance salesman, after being rejected, told George that his house, quote, would go up in smoke and your children are going to be destroyed, attributing his remarks to the, quote, dirty remarks you've been making about Mussolini. Another person who visited the house looking for handyman work warned George that a pair of fuse boxes would cause a fire someday. George was puzzled by the warning because they just had an electric stove installed and the electrician who installed it said that it was safe. In the weeks leading up to Christmas 1945, George's older sons had noticed a strange car parked along the main highway through town. The people in the car were watching the younger Sodder children as they were going home from school. The Sodder family was spending time together on Christmas Eve, 1945. Their oldest daughter, Marion, had been working at the dime store in downtown Fayetteville, and she surprised three of her younger sisters, Martha, Jenny, and Betty, with toys that she had bought for them as gifts. The younger children were very excited and asked their mom if they could stay up past their usual bedtime to play. At 10 p.m., Jenny told them they could stay up a little bit longer as long as the two oldest boys who were still awake, Maurice and Louis, remembered to put the cows in and feed the chickens before going to bed themselves. George and two of their older boys, John and George Jr., had spent the day working and were already asleep. After reminding the children of their remaining chores, the mom took Sylvia upstairs and went to bed. 12:30 a.m., Christmas morning. The phone rang, and Jenny, the mom, woke up and went downstairs to answer it. The caller was a woman whose voice she didn't recognize, and asked for a name that she was not familiar with. There was also the sound of laughter and clinking glasses in the background, like a party. Jenny told the caller that she'd reached the wrong number, later recalling the woman's weird laugh. Jenny hung up and went back to bed. As she did, she noticed that the lights were still on and the curtains were still not drawn, two things that the children normally attended to when they stayed up later than their parents. Marion had fallen asleep on the couch, so Jenny just assumed that the other children who stayed up had gone back to the attic where they slept. She closed the curtains, turned off the lights, and went back to bed. At 1 a.m., Jenny was once again awoken by the sound of an object hitting the house's roof with a loud bang, then a rolling noise as it rolled off the roof. She thought nothing of it and fell back asleep. A half hour later, she again woke up, this time smelling smoke. When she got up, she found that the room that George used for an office was on fire around the telephone line and fuse box. Jenny woke him up, and he woke up the older sons. Both of the parents and their 4 children, Marion, Sylvia, John, and George Jr., escaped the house. They yelled to the children upstairs but heard no response. They could not go up there themselves as the stairway was already up in flames. Their son John said in his first police interview that after the fire started, he went up to the attic to alert the sleeping children up there. However, he later changed his story and said that he yelled up to the attic and didn't physically see his siblings. The family's effort to contact any help was difficult. Their phone didn't work, so Marion ran to the neighbor's house to call the Fayetteville Fire Department. A driver on the nearby road had also seen the fire and called the fire department from a nearby tavern. The stranger, however, was unable to reach the fire department either because they couldn't reach the operator or because the phone there was also broken. Either the neighbor eventually got through to the fire department, or the stranger perhaps found another phone in town and got a hold of them. George, currently barefoot, tried to climb up the house's wall and broke open a window, tearing up his arm. He and his sons had the idea of using the ladder that they kept leaning against the house, but the ladder wasn't in its usual spot. They also couldn't find it nearby. A water barrel nearby that they could use to put out the fire was frozen solid. George then tried to pull both of the trucks that he used in his business up to the house and use them to climb to the attic window, but neither of them would start, despite having worked previously just 8 hours earlier. The 6 Sodders who had escaped had no choice but to mournfully watch the house burn down and collapse over the next 45 minutes. They assumed, as most would, that the other 5 children had perished in the blaze. The fire department, low on manpower due to the war and relying on individual firefighters to call each other, did not respond until later that morning. The chief, F.J. Morris, said the next day that the already slow response was further delayed by his inability to drive the fire truck, requiring that he wait until someone else who could drive it was available. The firefighters could do little but look through the ashes that were left in the Sodders' basement. By 10 a.m., Morris told the Sodders that they had not found any bones, as might have been expected if the other children had died in the house. According to another account, they did find a few bone fragments and internal organs, but chose not to tell the family. It has also been noted by modern fire investigators that the search was quick and lacked any real searching. However, Morris believed that the 5 children had indeed died in the fire, suggesting that it had been hot enough to burn their bodies and bones completely. Fire Chief Morris told George to leave the site undisturbed so that the state fire marshal's office could conduct a more thorough investigation. After 4 days, however, George and his wife just couldn't bear the sight anymore, so he bulldozed 5 feet of dirt over the site with the intention of converting it to a memorial garden for the lost children. The local coroner opened an inquest the next day, which found that the fire was an accident caused by faulty wiring. Among the jurors of the inquest was the man who had threatened George that his house would be burned down and his children would be destroyed for his anti-Mussolini remarks. Death certificates for the 5 children were issued to the family on December 30th. The local newspaper contradicted itself, stating that all the bodies had been found, but later in the same story, they reported that only part of one body was recovered. George and Jenny were too grief-stricken to attend the funeral on January 2nd, 1946, although their surviving children did go. Not long after, as they began to rebuild their lives, the Sodder family started to question all the official findings of the fire. They wondered why, if it had been caused by an electrical problem, their Christmas lights had remained on through the early stages of the fire, when the power should have gone out. They then found the ladder mentioned earlier that they keep against the house at the bottom of an embankment 75 feet away. A telephone repairman told the Sodder family that the house's phone line had not been burned, as the official record said, but it had been cut by someone who had both been willing and able to climb 14 feet up a pole and then reach out 2 feet away from the pole to cut the phone line. A man whom neighbors had seen stealing a block and tackle from the property around the time of the fire was identified and arrested. He admitted to the theft and claimed that he had been the one who cut the phone line, thinking it was a power line, but said that he had nothing to do with the fire. No record identifying this suspect exists, and why he would have wanted to cut the utility lines to the house while stealing the block and tackle has never been explained. Also, if he thought he was cutting the power line, as mentioned earlier, their Christmas lights remained on. He just cut the power line and went, I'm sure they'll go out eventually. Jenny said in 1968 that if he had cut the power line, no one would have made it out of the house alive. Also, I don't know what that means, because, Jenny woke up and smelled the smoke. So, if he had cut the power line, I don't understand how that would have affected their ability to get out. I also don't understand, if he cut the phone line, how did the wrong number call them? There's so many mysteries just right away that are like, what's happening? Jenny also had trouble accepting Morris's belief that all traces of the children's bones had been burned completely in the fire. Many of the household appliances had been found, still recognizable in the ash, along with fragments of the tin roof. She contrasted the rubble with a newspaper account of a similar house fire that killed a family of 7. Skeletal remains of all the victims were reported to have been found in that case. Jenny also burned small pieces of animal bones because she's a completely sane person to see if they would be completely consumed, but none ever were. An employee of a local crematorium she contacted told her that human bones will remain even after bodies are burned at 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, about 1,060 degrees Celsius, for 2 hours, far longer and hotter than the house fire could have ever been. The Sodder's truck failure to start also was questioned. George believed that it had been tampered with, perhaps by the same man who stole the block and tackle and cut the phone line. One of George's sons-in-law told a reporter in 2013 that he believed that George and his sons might have, in their haste to start the truck, flooded the engines. However, this is his son-in-law, he wasn't there, it's 2013, it's just a theory. After the wrong number phone call to the Sodder house was made public, someone suggested that it was connected to the fire. However, investigators were able to locate the woman who made the call, and she confirmed that it had just been a wrong number, and she might have been a little tipsy at the time. As spring approached, the Sodders planted flowers in the soil bulldozed over their house. Jenny tended carefully for the rest of her life. Further developments in early 1945 reinforced the family's belief that the children that they were mourning might, in fact, be alive somewhere. Evidence soon emerged that the fire had not, in fact, started in an electrical fault and was instead set deliberately. The driver of a bus that passed through Fayetteville late Christmas Eve said that he had seen some people throwing balls of fire at the house. A few months later, when the snow had melted, Sylvia found a small, hard, dark green, rubber-like object in a brush nearby. George, who recalled his wife's account of a loud thump on the roof before the fire, said that it kind of looked like a hand grenade or some other incendiary device used in combat. The family later claimed that, contrary to the fire marshal's conclusion, the fire had started on the roof, although there was no way to prove it. Other witnesses claimed to have seen the missing Sodder children themselves. One woman who'd been watching the fire from the road said that she had seen some of them peering out of a passing car while the house was burning. Another woman at a rest stop between Fayetteville and Charleston said that she had served them breakfast the next morning and noted the presence of a car with a Florida license plate in the parking lot. The Sodders hired a private investigator from a nearby town to look into the case. He informed the family that the insurance salesman who had threatened George over his anti-Mussolini sentiments had been on the coroner's jury that ruled the fire was an accident. He also learned of rumors that Chief Morris had, despite his report that no remains had been found a heart, which he later packed into a metal box and secretly buried. Morris had apparently confessed this to a local minister, who in turn confirmed it to George. George and the private investigator went to Morris and confronted him with the news. Morris agreed to show the two where he had buried the metal box, and they dug it up. They took what they found inside and took it to a local funeral director, who examined it and told them that it was actually fresh beef liver that had never been exposed to the fire. Due to the beef liver being fresh, more rumors circulated around Fayetteville that Morris himself had made the original rumor and then buried this fresh beef liver in hopes that the Sodders would find it and be satisfied that the missing children had indeed perished in the fire and not press the issue anymore. On one occasion, George saw a magazine photo of a group of young ballet dancers in New York City, one of whom looked like his missing daughter, Betty. He drove all the way to the girl's school, where his repeated demands to see the girl himself were refused. He then tried to get the FBI to investigate what he considered a kidnapping. The FBI director at the time, J. Edgar Hoover, personally responded to his letters with, quote, "Although I would like to be of service, the matter related appears to be of local character and does not come within the investigative jurisdiction of this bureau." He also said that if the local authorities requested the bureau's assistance, he would direct agents to assist, but the Fayetteville police and fire departments declined to do so. In August of 1949, George was able to persuade a Washington, D.C. pathologist to supervise a new search through the dirt at the house site. After a very thorough search, a dictionary that had belonged to the children and some coins were found. Several small bone fragments were also found, which were determined to be human vertebrae. The bone fragments were sent to a specialist at the Smithsonian Institute. There, they confirmed that they were in fact lumbar vertebrae from the same person. The report said, quote, "Since the transverse recesses are fused, the age of this individual at death should have been around 16 or 17 years. The top limit of age should be around 22, since the centra, which normally fuses at 23, are still unfused." With that knowledge, it's not very likely that these bones would have been from any of the missing children, since the oldest boy was only 14 at the time. The report, however, does mention that the vertebrae of a boy his age is sometimes more advanced enough to appear to be at the lower end of the age range between 16 and 22. He also noted that the bones showed no sign of exposure to any flame, and that it was very strange that those bones were the only ones found, since a wood fire of such short duration should have left full skeletons of all the children behind. The report concluded that the bones had, instead, most likely come from the dirt that George had used to bulldoze the site. Later, the private investigator confirmed that the bone fragments had come from the cemetery in nearby Mount Hope, but could not explain why they had taken them from there, or how they could be at the site of the house. According to the Smithsonian's records, the bones had been returned to George in September 1949, but their current location is unknown. The investigation and its findings attracted national attention, and the West Virginia legislature held 2 hearings on the case in 1950. Afterwards, the governor and state police superintendent told the Sodders that the case was hopeless and closed it at the state level. The FBI actually did decide that it had jurisdiction because the kidnapping might have crossed state lines, but then they also dropped the case after 2 years of following fruitless leads. With the end of the official efforts to seek a closure on this case, the Sodder family did not give up hope. They had flyers printed with pictures of the children offering a $5,000 reward for information that would have settled the case for even one of the children. It would soon double to $10,000. In 1952, they put up a billboard at the side of the house and another along US Route 6 with the same information. The family's efforts soon brought another reported sighting of the children after the fire. Ida Crutchfield, a woman who ran a Charleston hotel, claimed to have seen the children approximately a week afterwards. She said in a statement that she didn't remember the exact date, however. The children had come in around midnight with 2 men and 2 women, all of whom appeared to be of Italian descent. When she attempted to speak to the children, quote, "One of the men looked at me in a hostile manner. He turned around and began talking rapidly in Italian. Immediately, the whole party stopped talking to me." She recalled that they left the hotel early the next morning. Investigators today don't consider her story credible, as she had seen the first photo of the children 2 years after the fire, and then 5 years later decided to come out with the story. George followed up on leads in person, traveling to the areas from which tips had come. A woman from St. Louis, Missouri claimed that Martha was being held in a covenant there. A bar patron in Texas claimed to have overheard 2 other people making incriminating statements about a fire that happened on Christmas Eve in West Virginia some years before. None of these proved significant, sadly. When George later heard of a relative of Jenny's in Florida that had children that looked similar to his, the relative had to prove that the children were his own before George was satisfied. In 1967, George went to Houston to investigate another tip. A woman there had written to the family saying that Lewis had revealed his true identity to her one night after having too much to drink. She believed that he and Maurice were both living in Texas somewhere. However, George and his son-in-law, Grover Paxton, were unable to speak with her. Police there were able to help them find the 2 men that she had pointed out, but they had denied being the missing son. Paxton said years later that doubts about the denial lingered in George's mind for the rest of his life. Another letter they received that year brought the Sodders what they believe to be the most credible evidence that at least Lewis was still alive. One day, Jenny found a letter in the mail addressed to her, postmarked in Central City, Kentucky, with no return address. Inside was a picture of a young man of about 30, with features strongly resembling Lewis's, who would have been in his 30s if he had survived. On the back was written, "Lewis Sodder, I love brother Frankie, IL boys, A9032, or maybe A9035. The family hired another private detective to go to Central City and look into the letter, but he never reported back to the Sodders, and they never heard from him again, and they were not able to locate him afterwards. The picture nonetheless gave them hope. They added it to the billboard and put an enlargement of it over their fireplace. George admitted to a reporter later that next year that the lack of information had been, quote, "like hitting a rock wall. We can't go any further." He did vow to continue though, and in another interview he said, quote, "Time is running out for us, but we only want to know. If they did die in the fire, we want to be convinced. Otherwise, we want to know what happened to them." George Sodder died in 1969. Jenny and her surviving children, with the exception of John, who never talked about the night of the fire except to say that the family should accept what happened and move on with their lives, continue to seek answers to their questions about the missing children's fates. After George's death, Jenny stayed in the family home, putting up fencing around it and adding additional rooms. For the rest of her life, she wore black in an act of mourning and tended to the garden at the site of the former house. After her death, in 1989, the family finally took the weathered, worn billboard down. The surviving Sodder children, joined by their own children, continue to publicize the case and investigate leads. They, along with older Fayetteville residents, have theorized that the Sicilian mafia was trying to extort money from George and that the children may have been taken by someone who knew about the planned arson and knew that they would be safe if they left the house. It's possible that they were taken back to Italy. If the children had survived all those years and were aware that their parents and siblings had survived too, the family believes that they may have avoided contact in order to keep them from harm. Sylvia Sodder, the youngest of the Sodder children, died in 2021. She was in the house the night of the fire, which was her earliest memory, she says. "I was the last one of the kids to leave home," she told a reporter in 2013. She and her father often stayed up late, talking about what might have happened. She believes that her siblings survived that night, and assisted with efforts to find and publicize the case. Sylvia's daughter, in 2006, said, "She promised my grandparents that she wouldn't let the story die, that she would do everything she could." In the modern age, the family's efforts have come to include online forums in addition to media coverage. The increase in coverage has led some who have examined the case to believe that the children did in fact die in 1945. George Bragg, a local author who wrote about the case in a 2012 book titled West Virginia's Unsolved Murders, believes that John was telling the truth in his original account when he said he physically went up to the attic to wake up his siblings before fleeing the house. The reason he comes to this conclusion is because John is the one that's saying, "Let's just move on, they died in the fire, it is what it is, let's move on," while the rest of the family is still looking for answers. He does say, however, that his conclusions still may not be correct, saying, quote, "Logic tells you that they probably did burn up in the fire, but you can't always go by logic." Now, me personally, I highly disagree with this conclusion. I do think that you have to go by logic. However, logically speaking, there's too much going on to say that they perished in the fire. There's so much happening here. So, like I mentioned earlier, are they kidnapped? Did someone take them? Or did they actually die in this house fire? If they died in the house fire, was it intentionally set? So was it a murder? Or was it an accident, like the police chief said? Personally, I think that the children escaped, or at least were not there when the house burned down. And I also think the house fire was intentionally set. There's just too much going on for it to not be like that. The noises that she was hearing, that Jenny was hearing on the roof, the bus driver that said he saw people throwing fireballs at the house, I think that clearly indicates a on-purpose house fire. No bones is insane to me, in my opinion, based on other unsolved mysteries I've covered or other homicides I've covered. Their bones should be there. This was a log cabin that they lived in, so it would go up very fast. And like the cremator said, there were still bones after 2 hours. This went up in 45 minutes. So I personally believe that the children were out there somewhere. I think they're passed away now from old age, but I do think the children are out there somewhere, and I do think that the house fire was intentionally set. That's just my opinion on the matter. What's your opinion? Leave a comment down below, and if you liked the video, remember to leave a like and share with your friends. Thank you for choosing to spend some time with me today, and I'll catch you all in the next video.